Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Shriya and today we go to Sudan where the military junta and political parties have arrived at a civilian-led transition deal 1 year after a military coup led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Meanwhile in India, 2022 marks 30 years of the Babri Masjid demolition in India and finally a controversial civil code has been passed by the parliament in Indonesia that threatens personal freedom. The Sudanese military and political parties signed a framework deal on Monday, December 5, that provides for a civilian-led transition towards elections. The agreement would limit the military's formal role to a Security and Defense Council to be headed by a Prime Minister. However, key issues about transitional justice and the appointment of the Prime Minister after the final agreement are yet to be clarified. The African nation, which has been without a prime minister for nearly a year, has witnessed mass protests since the military coup of 2021. Prashant from People's Dispatch joins us with latest updates. Hello Prashant. So, can you tell us what is significant about the signing of this deal and what are the protesters demanding?
Right. So, Shreya, just to set some context, we do know that in 2008, towards the end of 2018, what is called the Sudanese Revolution began against the dictatorial rule of Omar al-Bashir. The protesters achieved great strides. Omar al-Bashir was forced to resign in 2019. And after that, there was an interim period. There was a massacre that took place in Khartoum in June 2019, after which the military pretty much consolidated its power. Now, immediately after that, in the next few months, the military and certain sections of the political elite, that is what is called the centrist political parties, the Forces of Freedom and Change, signed an agreement to sort of set up a transitional system in Sudan. So the idea was that, in the future elections would be held, but in the interim, the military and these sections would rule together. Now, from that time onwards, this was a deeply unpopular agreement because it did not address some of the core issues which the protesters who were part of the Sudanese revolution raised. And, because they were they were not just concerned about one leader, that was, of course, Omar al-Bashir was a key factor, but also about the system around him that was built. And the protesters contended that this transitional authority basically pretty much removed maybe some of the more problematic elements of the Omar al-Bashir regime, but pretty much left the system intact with the military in power. Now, this continued for a while, and in October 2021, the military overthrew which is what we've been saying, basically pretty much overthrew its own government because the military head was pretty much the head of the country as well. So it overthrew its own government and staged an outright coup and assumed complete power, which led to the further intensification of protests. And we do know that since October last year, almost 120 people have been killed, thousands have been injured because the people on the street have taken continuously to the streets. They have refused to accept the coup. So ever since the coup took place, now we do know that there has been a lot of pressure internationally to sort of bring back democracy, so to speak. And that is what has technically been achieved through this agreement that has been signed. So the military and political forces have signed an agreement. Once again, they've established a transition process which will take 2 years. A new prime minister will be appointed who will be a civilian. The chief of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has made those statements which talk about the military should not be involved in government, etc., etc. Again, the military's role technically, formally, will be restricted within the governing structures as well, and it will be supposedly more civilian run, etc., etc. But it is not surprising that the protesters, which include the Sudanese Communist Party, sections of the left, they see this as pretty much a return to that old transitional system in which the military actually held all the powers. That is why these protests are happening.
Yeah, also can you tell us how this deal is going to shape the politics in Sudan?
Right, so what lies ahead is a very difficult question because at this point we do know that there is a strong section of the protesters who are very militant, who continue to agitate against, this kind of deal and what has been happening in the past. Their demands are very clear. For instance, they want more justice, what is called transitional justice, a key plank of their demand, which is that a lot of the crimes that have been committed by the junta, since the coup and before, punishment for that, including from the topmost authorities. One of their major complaints is that there has been, the authorities who actually sanctioned all this violence will pretty much go scot-free. Their immunity will be legalized in this system in some format or the other. Secondly, they're not happy about the fact that the roadmap is not clear. There's still a lot of dates which are up in the air. The reform of the security system is something, against, as in the security forces, again something that's hinted at in these agreements. But again, there is no, proper roadmap for this. And this is important because the military controls a lot of the economy of the country as well. So there is a namesake reference to the fact that the military will withdraw, but how and all these. So all the difficult questions that the protesters have been raising for many, many years have not really been answered as far as they're concerned. And so what the protesters have been saying is that this legitimizes the coup. This is basically pretty much legitimizing the coup. It's turning the clock back. It's a return to the situation where certain sections of the political spectrum will be the front end, so to speak, whereas the military might continue to exercise all the power, at the back, because there's going to be no real accountability, no real justice for those who are involved in violence, in the loot of resources, etc. So I guess what we're going to see is, on the one hand, international players, on the other hand, are very happy because this is exactly what they wanted. The military junta and sections of the political elite to compromise and to present a face of democracy returning to Sudan. So I would say that I think on the one hand, we're going to see this consolidation of these two sections. On the other hand, the protesters, I think one of the most admirable things about the protests in Sudan is that they have kept the momentum going despite repression, despite just time. I mean, despite the fact that so much time has passed, they have continuously hit the streets. They have been a very organized force. It's been a very interesting example in that region, because we've seen a lot of waves of protests which have subsided over a while, but in Sudan these protests have continued. So will the Sudanese left, will the neighborhood resistance committees who are in the forefront of these protests be able to sustain it? A very big challenge for them, one thing to watch out for. Second question, of course, is that how sincere are the military establishment and the political elite going to be on this agreement? Will this just be a return to business as usual, using all these high-sounding words, but basically be business as usual? Or will they be even slightly able to advance any kind of meaningful reform? The protesters are very skeptical of it, but this is really a challenge before them. And I think the third question really also is for the international community. Are they actually going to hold any people accountable, demand any of this, or is it just everyone is happy because democracy has technically, for a namesake, democracy has returned?
Right, Prashant. Thank you so much for joining us on this issue. 30 years ago, a Hindu mob led the demolition of a 16th century mosque in the Indian town of Ayodhya, Uttar Pradesh. Despite assurances from the state's chief minister that no harm will come to the structure, what followed was not only destruction of the mosque but widespread violence in different parts of the country that killed roughly 2,000 people. The demolition of Babri Masjid became a turning point for Indian politics, unleashing forces of communalism like never before in the history of independent India. We're joined by NewsClick's Pragya to tell us more about what happened that day. Pragya, welcome to the episode. Can you start off by telling us what is the Babri Masjid dispute about?
Right, Shreya. So 30 years, the 30th anniversary of the Babri Masjid demolition. Actually, it's a very somber day. It's a day of remembrance, and it's not an anniversary which you remember with any measure of happiness, except perhaps those people who were in some senses or the other responsible for the bringing down of that structure. So this is actually a 16th century structure said to have been commissioned by Mir Baki, who was a general of the first Mughal emperor of India, whose name was Babur. So, the provenance and the use of that structure became a hot topic of discussion and debate in the modern era, pre-independence era as well. But yes, even after independence, it continued to be the Hindu right wing, continuously raised the provenance of that structure, saying that it was the birthplace of a god who is highly revered in India, that's Lord Rama. So the claim that the central dome of the Babri Masjid was the birthplace of the Lord Rama, one of the deities in Hinduism, became the source of much squabbling. And so a survey was ordered. The Archaeological Survey of India, a government body, actually got into trying to, there was a lot of digging, to put it simply. And as would happen in any civilization, there are layers. There are layers built upon layers. And so a layer was discovered which was of some kind of Hindu provenance. Right? Now, when this matter, after a long series of disputes and discussions and various lower courts making various orders, it reached the Supreme Court, the highest court of India, which basically said that there was a 350 to 400 year gap between the Hindu structure, or the structure which might very well have been a Hindu structure, and the mosque which was built in Babur's time by Mir Baki. So what does this show? It shows us immediately that the claim of the Hindu right that the Mughal Empire in India was established on the basis of destroying Hindu religious sites is untrue, because the structure below, the 350-year-old or 400-year-old structure below, had already, passed out of utilization. It was also built on top of a hill, and so on. So that was the first thing that we got to know, that we get to know from the 2019 Supreme Court order. And yet the Supreme Court decided that since the Hindu people of Hindu faith have a lot of, they believe that that was the birthplace of Rama, so it was handed over to the Hindu party in that particular dispute. Now, we have to remember how the demolition came about. It came about because a mob essentially raised it. Now, Kalyan Singh was the chief minister of the province in which this mosque stood, the Babri Mosque, and he belonged to the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which is ruling at the center and in the same province even today. He had given an undertaking to the Supreme Court that he would ensure that the mosque would not be demolished, and yet it was. So this is very important, because what this, the demolition of the Babri Masjid essentially was the first time that India actually stepped away from secularism in such a gigantic, in a jolting kind of a way. Right. So that was one of the things. And the second thing is the impact that it had. You mentioned the violence that it sparked off. It sparked up violence in India. We remember most the Bombay riots, now known as Mumbai, which were like extremely violent, and the toll was tremendous, 2,000 people. But also there was violence outside India, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So in a sense, it brought us back to the time when, before India's partition, where the Hindus and the Muslims were, sort of ranged against each other, and it was a very violent partition of people. So that essentially is the background and the sort of the politics behind the demolition of that mosque.
Right, Pragya. And on that note, can you also tell us why is it important to remember this day 30 years on?
Right. So, India is a youthful country. Most Indians are below 30 years of age. And what they would have no direct memory of what happened during, after, or before the demolition of that mosque. However, what we have seen happen over the last century through the courts, but more in a speedier way over the last 50 or 60 years, is that whenever there is such a dispute, then the courts tend to open up space for the Hindu side to claim a right over so-called disputed areas. Now, like I said, civilization is built in layers over layers. The Supreme Court has not said in 2019, while handing over the mosque to the Hindu side, that this was a temple. It has simply said that there were certain Hindu structures there, right? So you are demolishing somebody's place of worship, and you, being the majority religion, the Hindus are also claiming to be victims. So that is one of the things that, the demolition paved the way for this kind of a politics based on this kind of a deeply flawed logic. But also, since the courts have tended to hand over more rights to the Hindus, so they do exist other sites which are disputed. There are sites where temples abut mosques. There might well be sites where temples are under mosques. And so you have a situation where these claims are expanding. There is a larger number of claims coming out of similar disputes. And we have one in the same province of Uttar Pradesh, where again the same party is in power. And a particular mosque which abuts a temple has become the site of another such dispute. So basically, India has a law which says that the status of religious structures cannot be altered. It will remain as it was in 1947. So, which means that if a church is a church, it will remain a church, a temple will remain a temple, and a mosque will remain a mosque, and so on. Now, the Supreme Court had the opportunity in this new dispute to rely on this law and say that, well, this is just how it is. There might be competing claims, but this is what the law says. Instead of that, the Supreme Court has said that, well, the law bars us from changing the status, but it does not bar us from deciphering or discerning what the status is. So now you have a fresh dispute, you have a youthful country which might well have forgotten the details or would never have directly experienced the details of what happened then. And so you, in a sense, you have a new generation which will imbibe the spirit of, divisiveness over religion, and this new religious dispute will kind of take over the public imagination. Remember that there was a assurance from the state government in 1992 that no demolition would occur, and yet it did. So this is the primary problem. Now, many years ago, a very well-known professor, Professor Apurvanand, had told me that, I asked him, why do Indians get so engaged with this issue about temples and mosques and so on? So he said, well, a lot of people in the majority religion have developed a problem with the workings of history and time. So that is essentially what these disputes do: rake up issues from 600 years ago, make you forget what is happening in your present time, and sort of force you to think in the way that the Hindu nationalist government wants you to. And that's the principal problem with these kind of disputes.
Right, Pragya. So a lot of what is happening is there's a generation that does not remember or does not relate to the violence of the Babri Masjid dispute, and history is being used to change that episode a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. Indonesian parliament has unanimously passed a controversial criminal code that criminalizes premarital sex, live-in relationships, and restored a ban on any insult towards state institutions. Earlier in September 2019, when a full draft of the code was shared publicly, it was met with widespread criticism and protests on the grounds of violating privacy and freedom. The code, once implemented into law, carries harsh punishment for those found violating the law. Anish from People's Dispatch joins us with more details on this issue. Thank you for joining us, Anish. Can you tell us a little bit about what this criminal code is and why is it being criticized?
Well, the criminal code has been sort of like years in making, if you think about it, and is pretty much a sweeping change to the existing penal code and criminal code in Indonesia. A whole host of a big part of this change that we're seeing would include a whole host of sort of morality laws that are pretty much something that right-wing Islamists have asked for years now, and which is something that the government of President Joko Widodo or Jokowi is delivering at this point. Now, some of the, obviously we have all heard about the penalizing of extramarital or sex outside of marriage, or sexual relationships outside of marriage clause. It pretty much is like a very sweeping set of legal code, which will not only criminalize extramarital affairs, but also any kind of sexual relationships that happen before marriage between unmarried couples, including those who are in a live-in relationships or not in a relationship with a very set code of legal recognition for their marriage or relationships. And that can also include the large LGBTQ community, and also the more indigenous groups in western or eastern parts of Indonesia. There are also non-Muslim or very rural communities who do not have who do not really seek for marriage certificates and are kind of like set outside the whole legal system in many cases. So all of these people, there are like millions of people who are going to be affected by this. So these factors show a very clear tendency towards that sort of conservatism. On top of that, there is also bringing back of the penalizing of any kind of criticism of the official ideology, and also some of the posts, which also shows a certain kind of tendency towards condemning any kind of political dissent. The language is vague, although they are talking about adding clauses. They've already added clauses that protect free speech expressions under public interest. But all of these terms are quite vague. The laws are quite sweeping, so we do not really know how these things are going to be enacted in 3 years' time.
All right. So, like you said, you mentioned it also, this sort of moral policing has been, in years in making. And how do you think this is going to impact decades-long tolerance of Indonesia towards multiculturalism and the diversity in its population?
There is going to be a sort of death knell in many ways, because as I pointed out, there are different ways of understanding relationships. Even in the more traditional setup, we are not necessarily just talking about newer recognition of LGBTQ rights or live-in relationships, or cohabitation, but also traditional forms of marriage that are not necessarily part of this entire setup. There is also a section that will be criminalizing apostasy, which is leaving religion altogether. Now, obviously, Indonesia was never the sort of, while it was multicultural, it did not ever recognize atheism. But right now, penalizing atheism or irreligion is going to be a big factor to this. Obviously, Indonesia was also one of those few countries that never really criminalized same-sex relationships. But because of certain clauses, now even those relationships can be in danger. So this is sort of a regression in many ways that can impact the social fabric in many places where even understanding of religion is quite syncretic and may not be part of the whole fundamentalist approach or the more right-wing approach to how they practice the religion. Obviously, overwhelming majority are Muslims, but Islam itself has a very syncretic history in the region.
Thank you so much, Anish, for that update. And that's all we have for today, folks. For more such stories and updates from around the world, please follow us on peoplesdispatch.org and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.